Hello there. My name is Susi Dennison, and I'm the director of the European Power Programme at ECFR. While we're just rearranging the furniture, I'm going to start off by introducing this next panel. I've been swimming in the data which Mark has just been talking to you about for the last 6 months. Around the European Parliament elections. And so I've got the incredible honour of moderating this panel this afternoon, which is going to be looking at the political situation after the elections. We're doing something a little bit experimental here, not just with the furniture, but also with the panel. We're going to split the discussion into two halves. So we're going to have, in one corner, a political corner. In which we're very honoured to have three speakers from the political world. Firstly, Franziska Brantner, if I can invite you to take your seat. Member of the Bundestag for the Green Party, spokesperson for EU affairs and parliamentary whip. Secondly, Kostas Bakoyannis, if you'd like to take your seat as well. The mayor-elect of the city of Athens. And thirdly, Eva Maydell, MEP for the centre-right Bulgarian party, GAB. And then in the other corner, we're going to have an analytical group. So here I'm very pleased to introduce, not to say that you can't analyse as well, we just, different perspective. I'd first like to invite Marta Dassù, Senior Director for EU Affairs at the Aspen Institute and former Italian Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much. You're here. Secondly, Roland Freudenstein, the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies. And finally, our treasured board member, Sylvie Kauffmann, Editorial Director of Monde. So, having sort of explained who everybody is, just a few words on how this is going to work. Everybody's going to get 2 minutes to give a sort of an opening statement, but then we really want to start off a conversation. Firstly, between the different groups. Secondly, across the floor. Because the idea that we're trying to work with this afternoon is looking at how we can reach across the split screens between the different Europes that Mark has been describing. And then thirdly, we want to bring the conversation out off the stage onto the floor and allow everybody to join in. So just to kick us off, I think it makes sense if I just say a few words on what we think the political environment is that we're working in now. Firstly, I think we need to be clear that Europe is fragmented. The grand coalition of the centre, left and right no longer has a majority. We've seen an increased vote share for the Liberals, the Greens and anti-system parties, and we're all clear that creative coalitions are going to be necessary in this new environment. Secondly, Europe's volatile. In the months ahead of the elections, the survey work that we did showed that party loyalty is much less solid than it used to be. And actually, majorities of the 50% planning to vote, 51% as it turned out in the end, were considering voting for other parties, which rather suggests that the European Union in the next period is going to be judged on what it delivers, not who delivers it. Thirdly, it's change-driven. One of the most striking findings from the pre-election survey work that we did was that 3/4 of voters across the European Union think that either the national system or the European system or both are broken. Fourthly, Europe's on notice. We've seen that majorities across all member states except for Spain think it's quite likely that the EU could fall apart in the next 10 to 20 years. So we could interpret the surge in participation that we've seen in the European Parliament elections as a final chance for the EU to prove itself, to prove it can be different. And then fifthly, all of the above applies not just to the European Parliament, but to the other institutions as well. This illustration just shows you the extent to which the Council too is now it's not the break yet, is now more divided than it has been previously, roughly split three ways between EPP governments, Liberal Renew Europe governments, and then the Socialists and Democrats and other parties. So that's the picture that we're looking at. So let's dig into what this means for delivering the mandate that the European Union has been given. If I may, Franziska Brantner, I'd like to start with you on the question of climate. As Mark mentioned in his opening introduction, this is perhaps one of the clearest messages from voters in these elections has been the importance of climate change, not just for those who voted for Green parties, but across the piece. But at last week's European summit, we saw that it remains a very divisive issue in terms of getting agreement. Should we understand this as the green wave as being simply a northwest phenomenon, one on which the different regions of the EU are not going to agree, or do you see the real possibility for progress on this file?
Yeah, does it work? Yes. First of all, thank you for hosting that very female panel. I think that's actually really nice because usually I'm sort of the rare lone woman on such panels. So thanks for ECFR for making such a difference. And I think what was interesting in the figures you have showed and also what Mark was talking about, that we always thought in Germany people do care about the environment, about climate, and then we realized in Germany it's one among the lowest actually interests in climate and environment compared to other European countries, and that was sort of a surprise to many of us. And I think that the European elections have been a sign of confidence of European citizens in these institutions, going out massively to vote. And then really, also making a substantive choice. And I very much hope that Europe will deliver. It has to deliver. We may not allow this to fall apart. And yes, the Council last week did not manage to agree on the 250 target. But I think what will be more important even is to take steps. Because, it is to a certain degree easy to define goals that are in 2050. What we really need is action next year, the coming year, etc. And for most of these decisions, you don't need unanimity, but you need qualified majority voting. And I think then will be the real test to see, are the governments, the parliament ready to take real actions? And I think that will be much more important, and we all have to focus on it. And last point, I think, it was Poland, Czech Republic that refused to join in. And to a certain extent, they said, we need your help in the transformation away from coal. And they have a point there. I'm like, Germany is having this exit from coal with 40 billion euros investment in these regions. It's not little, 40 billion. And probably, in the Czech Republic, Poland, they are right to ask for a bit of support. So the question is Europe going to be in solidarity in that and sees it as a joint endeavor to go carbon neutral? So I hope that we will not make this an East-West divide, but a common project, and that we have so much to gain from it if we do it all together. And we have to do it, otherwise we will lose so many young citizens. And if they turn away from Europe, I think that would be a real disaster.
Thank you very much indeed. Eva Maydell, one of the other issues which became very apparent in these elections, where different parts of Europe see the question differently, is indeed on the question of movement of people and the strong preoccupations with immigration in some parts of the EU, and the impact that has on economies, the way that communities are changing and so on. Do you see this as something that that national governments and the EU together can come up with answers on in the next political period, or do you see this as something that's likely to remain one of the drivers of discontent among Europeans, but to which there is no easy answer?
Well, the very short answer to that very difficult question is I would definitely want to work towards that aim, and I hope there will be an answer. But I just quickly want to go a little bit backwards. 5 years ago, when I campaigned for the European Parliament elections, connecting with my voters on Europe and on the free movement topic was very easy. Basically, the narrative would go, European Union is a great thing, we've benefited a lot, and yet we a little bit miss our children that are far away from us, whether they study or they work, but overall is a good thing. 5 years down the line, the narrative is very changed. they do still believe Europe is a good thing, but they're like, they're almost at the verge of saying that Europe has stolen their kids. So I think it's a real issue that we should be addressing, and it has been part of my own campaign in the past couple of months, but it has gone into the narrative of how important it is that those young people or competent professionals actually do return to their countries. Because what we witness now is that newer member states, they are desperately in need of skilled workers, of skilled people. We are in need of investors in order for our economies to basically spire up and have this new economic model. But when investors do come in countries like Bulgaria or Croatia or Romania or other countries part of Central and Eastern Europe, there are no professionals out there. And so there's this vicious circle in a way. We are very happy of what the EU has to offer, but in the same time, this nationalistic prospect of having your family close to you, it's extremely easy to trigger this elusive political offers that are there around on the table. And sometimes they come in different packages. Sometimes they can come from a TV star equipped with populism or an old heroes using nostalgia, for example. So I think we need to be, on one hand, very clear to make sure that those countries are catching up even faster than they're catching up right now. Because when we as politicians use the term emigration, we understand that people are leaving, but when citizens use the term emigration, actually they feel that that's the meltdown of a nation, both culturally as well as in numbers. So it's perhaps the one thing that we have to start addressing now, because I don't want to feel 5 years down the line from today onwards the way we feel now about climate change and about those goals that we should reach much faster. A couple of weeks ago, my political group had our brainstorm session, and we were talking about things we should have been honestly talking 5 years ago or even earlier. So for whichever generation we are talking about, whether it's the next generation, the current generation, the generation of my parents, Europe has to show that we can take decision in a swifter way, and we need to deliver clear deliverables in a way for citizens, things that citizens can understand better, address those topics that are most close to their hearts. Because the topic of immigration is something that if you phrase it the way we phrase it in this debate, people will be like, oh no, that's not a problem. But if you go in depth and you explain it, I think there hasn't been a single citizen that I met during my campaign that does not have a very close relative or a distant relative that's been abroad for at least the past 5 or 10 years. So it's a serious concern that we need to address, because then it spirals into anti-Europeanism, and then it's actually the problem of the countries where those people are, because they're like, it's Europe, or it's Germany, or it's France, or it's Spain that stole those bright minds. And it's so sad to see the free movement in this way, and it's something we need to start considering right away, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Kostas, Bakoyannis, coming from Greece and listening to these comments from your colleagues so far, do you think that the keys to Europe looking fairer and appearing more in touch with what people are concerned about lie in these questions, or do you see this? Do you see the answers elsewhere?
Well, I should also thank you for the invitation. To be perfectly blunt, I don't understand why we are surprised at the results. There's no surprise here. I mean, many of us have been talking about Europe in theological terms for a very long time. We talk about Europe, and we are right, as this amazing, unique, unprecedented historical experiment, about this wonderful peace project. It's all true. But all this happened many decades ago. And right now, we have a society that faces real problems and demands real solutions. So I think the key mistake that we've been making in our reading and in our interpretation of these results is that we are looking for this dividing line between pro and anti-Europeans. That is clearly not the case. We have different national experiences, that's true. We also have different communities within our nations. We have different populations who have different expectations, different hopes, different fears. And of course, the key question is how we can actually bridge this divide. So let me just, without hopefully being too self-referential, try to give you an example of what happened in Greece. I'm sure most of you have been following Greece over the past few years. We have been the canary in the coal mine. I mean, everything that could go wrong has gone wrong in my country. But then, of course, Brexit came along, and we all feel much better about what happened in Greece. So one of the most tragic outcomes of the crisis was that we came, for the first time in the history of the country, we had to face a neo-Nazi party. It's called the Golden Dawn. Now, their birthplace was actually also the birthplace of democracy, Athens. Their birthplace was actually special parts of Athens, special areas of Athens, where they had astronomical percentages. They even went over 20%. In 2014, in the municipal elections, they got more than 16%, which you realize was a real shock to many of us. In this election, the percentage was halved. It was half of that. How did this happen? Did the people change? No. It was exactly the same voters. What changed was our outlook. Because we made the following mistake. We went very ideological. We were right about everything we've said about Golden Dawn. Make no mistake. We were absolutely right. That they were fascists, that they were neo-Nazis. But then we changed our tone in the last few months. What did we do? We depoliticized the issue, we depolarized the issue, and we started talking about real life, about real and tangible differences that we can achieve in the daily lives of our people. And suddenly, the people started listening. Because at the end of the day, and that's of course the big advantage of local government, which works bottom-up, it's not about a grand theory, it's not about an abstract scenario, it's about real life. It's about jobs, it's about the kindergarten or the school, it's about all these small and bigger things that define our daily existence. So I think this also shows the way for all of us in Europe. I was talking to my 12-year-old son just 2 days ago. He asked me, why are you going to Lisbon? I said, I'm going to talk about Europe. And then he said, okay, Dad, what does Europe do for me? Now, clearly, I couldn't go back to the 1950s and 1960s. So maybe I was mistaken, but the first example that came to my mind was roaming. If roaming is the only thing we can offer 12-year-olds, then we're in trouble. So I think there's a lot of work we can do. I fully agree that the challenge is that we need to make sure that we don't talk in 5 years about what we have to talk about today. Thank you.
And to put that question back to you very quickly, if to avoid that in 5 years' time we will be sort of fighting another existential election, what would you pinpoint as the kind of the one or two things that you hope will be achieved in the next political period that would make Europe seem like it was delivering on the things that will matter to the next political generation?
Well, I'm sure that all of us have different ideas and different proposals because all our thoughts are informed from our national context. At least coming from Greece, a lot of it has to do with socioeconomic. Has to do with poverty, has to do with unemployment, has to do with social inclusion. You know, it's not very successful or effective to talk to someone who has no food on his plate about how to hold the knife and the fork, which is unfortunately what we've been doing for the past few years.
Thank you very much. Franziska, can I ask you a similar question? What would you hope that in 5 years' time we'll be able to say was a success story of the next period for Europe?
Starting with what he said, please, in terms of reconforting the social fabric I think it's a key challenge, and I think to keep and increase and strengthen that social fabric while at the same time organizing and supporting the transition of our economy towards a carbon neutral economy, that will be the main challenge. And if we don't work on this and don't deliver on that, we're doomed. And the second one is, of course, the foreign policy area, in terms of finding our way between China, Russia, etc. So, I don't have to go into the details, but I think these are the two big challenges. Socio-economic transitions, strengthening social fabric across European member states within them, and the second one, dealing with the internal, external threats that are often intertwined, and getting more immune and more resilient in fighting them.
Great, thank you very much.
And if I may, because I just wanted to agree very much on what you said and talking about everyday problems of citizens. It sounds maybe awkward, but we as Greens in Germany were the only party gaining votes from former AfD voters. All the other parties lost votes to the AfD. We won 50,000 votes from the AfD. And usually we're always presented as the opposite. There's the Greens and there's the AfD. But in fact, we were the only one managing to go and gain votes from that side. And I think we did it exactly because we have been over the last couple of years only talking about housing, transport, how do you get to my work, etc. So the very nitty-gritty details, which are so important to citizens. And I think that was, if you also say that was part of your success story, it certainly was of ours.
Thank you. Yes, Eva, feel free to, you get your 2 cents to react to your comments, but also if you can give us a sneak preview on what you were discussing with EPP colleagues a couple of weeks ago in terms of the priorities you're going to be pushing.
No, but very briefly, my 2 things based mainly on the intervention that I initially gave. Well, it will be really good if Europeans are not forced to leave their own countries due to economic reasons. So they should freely travel, work or whatever, but not just because they think they can live better or earn better elsewhere. And there, in terms of concrete deliverables, as we are discussing the next budget of the European Union, perhaps we should think how to make the budget more equipped for this sort of challenges. And the other thing is Europe does not reach everywhere in Europe. Yeah, it reaches in Berlin and Paris and Lisbon and all the capitals across the EU, but it does not reach a lot of regions. And I don't speak here about that popular word that many people don't even know what it is, cohesion policy. I'm speaking that there's a lot of youngsters out there that have never been on our most popular program, Erasmus, that have never been abroad, that do not know a single European from another member state, that do not think about the opportunities and do not know about the opportunities Europe has to offer. And it's a very difficult thing. It's not just about rebuilding a school with EU funds or making a road with EU funds. I think it's such a complex issue that you have a big chunk of the young generation of Europe which maybe does not study. Of course, we meet the ones that study, the ones that are the brightest and the best, but there's so many out there that we need to think about. We do not want to have a part of the next generation to be a lost generation because Europe did not reach to them.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to give this side of the stage a little rest for a moment, but don't go to sleep because I want to bring you back into the conversation in a minute. Turning now to our analytical side of the room, as I called it. I want to sort of move now from the Europe that we want to the Europe that we think we're going to get over the next 5 years, and how practically we think things are going to work. And I wondered if I could start, Marta, Dassù, with you on this question which Franziska has raised about the strong message from European voters about feeling insecure in an unpredictable world. Do you think that we're going to see a step change on this front in the coming years in terms of the EU pulling together as a global actor?
It's difficult to say because that, first of all, implies a real agreement on the budget. You were alluding to it at the very beginning, and this is quite difficult. We do not have enough money, in general. We have decided not to approve new financial instruments, for instance, the budget for the Eurozone suggested by Macron. And we will have a harsh battle about the way in which we will decide our priorities. So first of all, we have the usual question of money, which is a very difficult one to solve by definition. Secondly, we have a cultural problem, because the way in which the EU was conceived at the very beginning and for all these decades it was not conceived to act, to be a player in this kind of world. The world we live in today is very different. It's again a competition between global powers, especially China and the US. The European Union is squeezed in between. So the EU has to decide to be able to play that game, and this entails a different set of policies, in my view. Just to give a list, we have to clarify ourselves about the meaning of strategic autonomy that implies what we are willing and able to do on the defense front, first of all. Then, in my view, but this is a topic which is very divisive again, we have to review our competition policy, because in my view we had a policy which was also a right one in a certain period, totally in favor of the consumer. But now we have to build up the industrial policy able to allow us to compete in this new environment. And then clearly we need a foreign and security policy worth of the name. So in a nutshell, I think that Europe has to change, not only because the message of change was very clearly expressed into these recent elections, but because we live in a totally different world. The European Union of the past is not equipped to play this kind of game, and so we have to gain the instruments to be able to do so. Otherwise, we will enter a period in which, in a way or another, we will have a sort of radical confrontation between European technocracy on the one hand and nationalists on the other, and the European Union will not be able to survive, as we all hope.
Thank you. Roland Freudenstein, Marta says that Europe needs to change. You are a long-term observer of that process from Brussels. What's your sense from the last few weeks about whether or not Europe is changing, and what's your sort of prediction on what the big rows, the big division issues are going to be over this next period?
Well, thanks, Susi. Thanks for having me. And you asked me what I feel about the last couple of weeks. Well, we're in the country of saudade, which is it's intranslatable basically, but it's a kind of constructive melancholy, the way I read it. That's probably my answer to your question. But having said that, you know, there was a big sigh of relief after the elections that the nationalists did not gain as much as they were expected to gain. There was a big sigh of relief, and it was actually predicted by Mark and by you and your colleagues that migration was not the big topic in this election, and probably is not the big topic anymore for most Europeans. But I would advise some caution. I mean, first of all, migration may well come back. You know. Second, we might as well, in the next couple of years, be discussing a severe economic crisis. You know, and it will be, as usual, it won't be exactly like what we've seen before. It will be something different, a global downturn or something. And third, if we talk about climate change and the new urgency of that topic, I would say, and here I'm quoting actually Ralf Fuchs, a famous German Green, who says, and I totally agree, that the climate topic can become as divisive, as poisonously divisive, as the migration topic has been. Again, it's a different topic. It will work out in different ways, but it can split our populations inside our own member states, and it can split East and West poor and rich within the European Union. If I just come back on one of the topics you've discussed with the politicians over there, emigration and brain drain and so on. Well, look, like with the global migration problem, the only sustainable solution to that is massive economic growth in the countries of origin. So let's please take that into account. This growth will not, you will not make Bulgaria, Romania, Poland grow in the same way with green jobs and getting out of coal and out of nuclear at the same time as you have in Western Europe. That will not be possible. So we've got to figure out something new. And here's my last idea. You know, people's parties have been criticized rightly, sometimes wrongly, in the last couple of years. It's almost fashionable, also with a certain dynamic liberal crowd, some of whom I see here in front of me, you know, to say that, oh, the center-right and the center-left are so passé, they're so 20th century. You know, if we talk about these divisive issues, and this is true for migration and for emigration, and certainly for climate, there is one side that feels they're left behind in our societies and among the member states, and the other side that feels they're surging ahead. People's parties are par excellence suited to bridge that gap. That may be a big weakness. I believe it has worked against the centre-left and the centre-right in these elections and some other recent elections. But it's no coincidence that The Economist 3 months ago had a Charlemagne column, 3 cheers for the People's Parties, coming from that magazine. Well, great. You know, I can only agree. So if Social Democrats and the centre-right manage to turn that weakness of having a foot in each of the 2 camps into a strength, you know, by emphasizing a point of identity that they have in their party families, then I think they'll be indispensable tools to secure our future in Europe.
Thank you very much. Sylvie Kauffmann, interesting take from Roland that a lot of attention is being put on the kingmaker role, potential kingmaker role of the Liberals and the Greens in this new environment. But should we be looking instead to a reinvention or a resurge from those centrist parties? How do you see the sort of the alliances and coalitions working in this new Europe? And do you think that we're going to get a sort of a more issue-based approach in the sense that we've seen in the European Parliament spreading to other institutions of the EU?
You know, I don't know if it's a great time to be a politician in Europe at the moment, yes, but it's a fantastic time for journalists because this is so exciting to watch. Sometimes I agree with you, it's a little bit dispiriting, but you can always hope for what did Mark say, 2024? But I think before that we'll see interesting developments. You know, everything is broken. You mentioned that that's what you found in your polls, that people are aware of this, have of this notion of broken systems. They can see it. The problem is that, and they also are aware that the EU can fall apart and that, you know, Europe is mortal after all. So that's a very important feature, I think. And Emmanuel Macron, his dream of transposing to the European scene what he did on the French scene, in fact, is almost succeeding, even though he failed in his objective of getting those transnational lists. But if you look at European Parliament today, yes, I mean, it's not as stark as the French political landscape, it's not as dramatic, but the trends are the same. So, you know, the traditional parties on the wane and new parties, new trends, new alliances being emerging. The problem is that, as Emmanuel Macron knows very well, it's easier to destroy and demolish than to build. So, and it will take time. So we have this where he hasn't succeeded is to form, and that's what he's going to try, is to form this centrist. So it's also interesting that we cannot agree really on the term centrist. Is it progressive? Is it liberal? Because those traditional parties are also called center left, center right, and you know, it's not so easy to say you have the far-right parties on one, or nationalist parties on one side, and then the rest. It's not workable. I don't think so. So it will have to. You will have to find differences, ways to identify the political trends better, and so. We can see already the first tensions, you see, with the, so this name of Renew Europe is very strange. I think it's, well, anyway. But, so in that group, you have En Marche already confronting Ciudadanos on their alliances with Vox, the far-right party in Spain. So this is a red line that Macron's party or movement, because it's not exactly a party yet, is drawing, and I think it's a very serious red line. No, I mean, Macron won against Marine Le Pen, and this fight is still going on, and he's campaigned again this time during the European election on this cleavage between, you know, the far right and the democratic forces. So he cannot just make a group in European Parliament with people who join the far right in their countries, in their own country, just for the sake of, you know, joining some local councils. So this is all in the making. It's very much on the move, and it has to evolve. But I mean, if I can make a warning, it has to go ahead. It has to move ahead. We cannot just spend 5 years, you know, thinking about what new realignment we need and how we're going to work this out. People are angry, people are frustrated, people are interested in Europe, they have shown it, but we shouldn't delude ourselves. They want a Europe which works and which brings results. You know, you cannot just govern on fear. And one last thing, about this, Luca said we shouldn't talk about what is being discussed in Osaka behind our backs, about this composition of about the repartition of the top jobs. But what I heard in Paris before the last European Council was around Macron was we should come out of this council with some results, because we cannot get intoxicated with those summits which decide nothing. I mean, heads of governments and heads of state spend 2 days of their work, and it's precious time for all of them, meeting in Brussels, you know, spending the night negotiating, and at the end of those 2 days, they come to the press and say, we haven't been able to come to an agreement, and we'll meet at the next European Council. It's just this is not going to work, or we'll have far worse results at the next election. So
absolutely. So just to push you a little bit on that, and maybe sort of others want to come in on this question too. How do we avoid talking about alliances for the next 5 years, talking about positioning, and how do we sort of get on to delivering the mandate? Is it about more fluidity in terms of sort of issue-based alliances, that we can work with nationalists on economic questions, but we can't work with them when it comes to differences of view on rule of law? How would you see that evolving?
I think you mentioned that in your first question, and one avenue, of course, is projects, to build coalitions around projects, and so this is a way of achieving some results at least, but I don't think it is, I mean, it can work for a while, but it has to be structured more firmly, I think.
Did you want to?
If you wish. The European Parliament has always been built up upon variable alliances, so we never had a linear setup. This is becoming even more complicated now, but it was already true before. Clearly, we will have to set up ad hoc coalitions, in my view, on sectoral issues. As I said before, a big decision is about the distribution of money. There is no doubt about it. The ecological transition will be expensive. We will have to introduce social compensation measures, because it is true that we will have a lot of resistances. If I may insert one word on Italy, because Italy, after all, is a large country, and it is a bit out of sync from a political point of view and also from an economic point of view. What I think it is interesting looking at the European election results for Italy are two facts which are worth taking into mind, in my view. The first one is that the League is a nationalist, rightist party. It is not a populist party. The Five-Star Movement, the populist party, is already in crisis, in a very, very huge crisis. So from a certain point of view, you could say, looking from the Italian standpoint, that you are entering a post-populist phase, and the political scenario is much more clear. You have the extreme right on ascendancy, the nationalist parties, with a limited amount of voting, the 23%, more or less, but they are there. They are not suggesting exiting Europe, because Brexit was a lesson for all of us, but they are suggesting a different kind of Europe that is more or less a confederation of nation states, as opposed to a more integrated union. So you have two different visions of Europe, and in a sense, we have to decide whether we are ready to build up some bridges on some key points, or we prefer to have two clashing projects. So my first point is, maybe the populist wave is already in decline. In a sense, the elections in Turkey, in Istanbul, could be an harbinger, if you wish, of something new to happen. Let's hope so. And what is there to stay is the strength of rightist nationalist parties, and Italy is an example. Second point on Italy, which is important in my view, is that from a political point of view, you can pretend to have a relevance. This is the case of Salvini. In reality, you are irrelevant. If you look at foreign policy, for instance, the League has a split loyalties. They are pro-Americans, pro-Russians, pro-Chinese. They apparently do not understand that a sort of new high-tech Cold War in the making is there, so it's impossible to be pro-Chinese and pro-American and pro-Russian at the same time. So irrelevance. From an economic point of view, since Italy is the third largest economy in Europe in any case, the problem of Italy is a systemic problem. Italy is a problem, but there you have the markets more and before than the European institutions. So my viewpoint is that the European Union will have to manage very carefully the Italian problem, because we can't reward fiscal irresponsibility, clearly, but we can't play in the hands of the positions a la Salvini. We can leave the markets to make the dirty job, if you wish, and we can be open, from a certain point of view, to the idea that we need to invest more resources in new policies. So Italy is a very interesting, in my view, case point. We will see how it's going to play out. Keep a watch on it, and try to play the right game.
Thank you very much. Yes, Roland, if you wanted to come in.
Right, thanks. When Marta beautifully talked about the Italian problem, I was for a second tempted to talk about the German problem, but that would take us 2 hours, so I'm not going to do that.
2 minutes.
Exactly. No, coming back to the notion of federalism, I think it's not about nationalism or federalism, it's about what kind of federalism. And of course there is a more centralist version of that term, and there is a more decentralized version of that term, which relies more on diversity, which relies on, you know, the parts of the sum are as important as the sum. And yes, there is a good case to be made that the majority of Europeans might not want what, for example, Emmanuel Macron and many other French people have demanded in terms of...
AKK, to give you an example, doesn't want.
For example, there's one European citizen who does not care for gouvernement économique, which is different, to be differentiated from economic governance. Government. I think that beautifully sums it up. We are going to continue this debate, and I'm firmly on the governance side and not the government side.
Thank you very much. Let's bridge the divide and bring both sides of the conversation back in. Reactions, comments from this side on this question on the sort of the limits of tolerance for alliances and so on. But also, I'd be interested in your views on. I think it was Roland Freudenstein that said that that political parties, sort of pro-European parties, have been breathing a collective sigh of relief about the situation. That the elections weren't as bad as expected, and certainly from a distance, looking at the sort of the rows over the leadership positions over the last weeks, one could be forgiven from the outside for thinking that we've just gone back to business as usual, and I guess that's the big risk here. What's your take on how this is developing? Who would like to?
You know, I think there were reasons to be relieved, you know, because we had expected worse. Can we be satisfied with that? No, of course not. So I think, you know, you have to, you still at one point can celebrate that the far right did not get stronger, but still it is quite strong, and in some countries it was first, etc. So it's certainly not a moment where you can sit back and say, ooh, and now we continue with the status quo. I firmly believe that just defending the status quo will not work, and it will. That's why I said it was a vote of confidence, but we might lose that trust very easily if within the next 5 years no results will be delivered. So in that sense, I agree in terms of, you know, dear politicians, don't get comfortable. So I think that's completely right. But I wanted to address that point in terms of, you know, climate change, will it be the divisive issue? What we've seen, and that was also part of your polls partially, is that the same people who, you know, who hate foreigners and who hate homosexuals, they are also climate deniers. So in that sense, the split is almost the same. It's very, you know, you rarely meet somebody who is denying climate change and who loves homosexuals and refugees. It's usually the same split. So the climate split might reinforce the other split. And that's, you know, where I think democracy and climate change comes together. And I think that's what we have to be aware of. And, you know, when you said, you know, Bulgaria, what will be its future in other countries? Seriously, will Bulgaria's future be coal? I think their leaders would be stupid if they think that that will be the future. So the question is rather, what will be the business model of Bulgaria with new technologies, etc. I think you would be ill-advised to set on coal. So, you know, I think that it might be really your chance of going ahead of the other countries that are even slower. So, but I agree that Europe should help in that transformation process. And it's an economic and social transformation process. And that we should really do it together, and that, for example, Germany should be ready to finance more for that. I've been very disappointed about the Euro budget, but in general about the framework discussion. So I think, you know, if we really say this is the big European project to have that social economic transition and having higher social cohesion, etc., we can't have it for 1%. It's just too low. So that, I think, we should put in the front and not getting divided or saying, you know, we go back. I think going backwards is not really an option, also not on climate change. And I think if I may react to you, because I think you made this very good point in terms of, if our citizens don't come back, how do we get there? And I know on the other side, our German situation when it comes to the care of the elderly, etc., that we need many more of Bulgarians, Polish, etc. citizens to take care of our elder. So how are we going to resolve that situation? And I think that's where we start to have a very open and honest discussion about it. Because we only start realizing the impact of our irresponsible sort of not having thought about we're going to have more elder people and that they need some treatment and somebody to take care of them, and that we just say, oh, whatever, there are Polish people coming. And most Germans don't think about what that has as an impact in Poland, Bulgaria, and other countries. And we need to start having those conversations.
You've just triggered a two-finger from
I
Sylvie.
just wanted to jump on this, that in Bulgaria and Poland and Romania, they also need people to take care of their elderly and their children.
Totally.
So
And we just count on the fact that even though we pay them poorly, it's much better paid than in Bulgaria and Croatia.
Yep.
And that's the terrible sort of situation we have.
So are we ready then to talk about this as a common challenge Europe-wide?
Yeah, and in every sector, but I think how? I mean, one way, and it's a little bit of a sentimental thing, but I think we are not there yet, is if more Europeans will be proud to call themselves Europeans. I'm sure everyone's proud to be Polish or Bulgarian or Finnish, but I also feel European, and I'm not sure how many of the Europeans across the member states would say they feel European. And I think it links also to the point where Europe just does not reach to everyone, and not everybody can feel European, because for some Europeans, feeling European is something weird. Because they think Europeans are well-educated, wealthy, being able to travel, privileged. Well, we all are actually Europeans. And it's very difficult to invoke that sentiment. And I hope it's going to be different for the younger generation. And I think where we can make a difference is when topics such as climate change, or as it was with copyright in the previous European mandate, we actually relate to that generation. We just do not close the door for them on these topics, but we actually engage with them on topics such as this one. And many more will come in the days ahead of us. But by the way, in Bulgaria, we also have very good engineers that we lack, very good doctors that are currently actually in Germany and France and so on, but as well as people that do take care of elderly people. Last time I did my annual check in Bulgaria, 2 out of the 3 doctors that performed the checks were foreigners and not Bulgarians, coming from one of them Western Balkan and the other one from Ukraine. So we are also in constant need. But if I am to open the debate of how many professionals we need in Bulgaria, that we actually need to bring them, whether through blue cards or other ways, people would not be happy about this discussion. The discussion that they want to hear and they want to see happening is their children and their grandchildren coming back. And it's a very emotional thing for citizens. So right now, those people cannot feel European and cannot feel like we are all part of the same thing because they feel somewhat disadvantaged.
Thank you very much. Just quickly on your question about feeling European, we have the answers for you on that. If it's about being European and your nationality, the levels of this sentiment are actually surprisingly high, apart from in France, where people still prefer to feel French. But we can share that with you afterwards.
Was Bulgaria part of your survey?
Kostas, if you want to have a
yes,
last word on this, and then we'll open it to the floor.
I'm a bit worried when I hear about this sign of relief. To be perfectly honest, it stresses me out. Because I'm afraid that we'll have exactly the same conversation next year and the year after that.
Right.
So, and at least my sense is that Europe is just moving forward with business as usual. I haven't seen any, at least publicly, expressed self-criticism or even any self-doubt. I haven't heard any real debate or discussion about how everything went wrong or anything went wrong. One gets a sense very often that Europe is about Brussels and not about the whole of the continent. So, and I understand that it's also very fashionable A few years ago it was immigration, now it's climate change. New issues come up, we like talking about them, makes sense to talk about them. But we also, I think it's helpful not to lose sight of the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that right now we have a culture war and an identity war going on within our societies. It's very easy to stereotype. It's very easy to let our prejudices take control. It's very easy to let our fears take control. It also saves time. But in real life, it's a very, very dangerous process. So for example, I don't know how it is in Germany. In Greece, we find the following. Amongst the ages of 18 and 30, they are neoliberal when it comes to economics, but they are extremely open when it comes to human rights and social rights and gay rights. And at the same time, they are very conservative when they talk about the church. Now, that may not make sense when one tries to map the political and social behavior of previous generations, but it makes completely sense for this generation. So I think we have to be careful not to let past experiences drive our analysis. And one more thing, it's tempting, I understand, to join a competition or a race amongst ourselves. Bulgarian nurses, Polish, plumbers, Greek waiters, German mechanics and Italian doctors, whatever. But at the end of the day, we all know very well that whatever we do has to do with the incentives that we give our own people. People do not opt to leave our countries because they want to. In most cases, they opt to leave our countries because they have to. It's not a question of luxury, it's not a choice, it's a question of need. So rather than looking at other countries and what they do, it's best to look at our own country and what we do, or basically what we don't do.
Thank you very much. I think we have a roving microphone somewhere in the room. So I'm going to invite, yes, here it comes down here, thank you. I'm going to invite now to join in the conversation. Tell us what you think the big challenges, the big fights are, and how we shape this next political period to ensure that Europe delivers on its mandate. Please let us know who you are, and please keep your comments brief. I think lady there is the first.
Thanks. Patrycja Sasnal, I'm from the Polish Institute of International Affairs. I found the panel both interesting but also a bit disappointing. The interesting part is that it's interesting to listen to European politicians who sort of imply that Europe is responsible for what a European has or has not on its plate, or his or her plate. I wonder whether we're not mistaking the circles of responsibility, the political responsibility. It's first and foremost the national government's responsibility for the well-being and economic prosperity of a country. So until we are not a federation or a joint entity, we cannot really make Europe responsible for that. What I thought was disappointing was the mere mention from Franziska about the climate changes and the results that are coming from them. You mentioned that it's a new divide, or the divide of opinions about climate change reinforces the old division, probably between the left and the right, or the natural political divisions. But if we look at the polls, they show that more than 80% of Europeans, particularly in the south, and this was a poll done in the run-up to the COP24 meeting in Poland last year, more than 80% of Europeans think of climate change as a real and big threat. So within the 80-something%, we have to have people on the right as well. So it's a communitarian challenge. It's a communitarian theme that can actually unite the continent and is within the European circle of responsibility. So I guess my question to the panel, probably to the analytical side of the panel as well, would be to to address the issue of climate change, because it's when we think of the future that is being cooked up for us, it's not surprising that Europeans think that the EU might not be there in 10 years' time if the Earth is dying. So
Thank
please
you.
do answer that.
I am going to take other questions, but I'm just going to give Franziska a quick right of reply because I'm a bit concerned that her comments have been mistaken from your question.
Yeah, I didn't mean it at all that this is a divisive issue in terms of splitting the citizens, but what I meant is that those who deny climate change, and they are few, they're certainly not a big majority, that they are often on the same lines, and that's what you get from polls. But these are really, it's a minority, complete minority. And that's why I really plead for Europe not to be divided on the issue, but to see it as a common challenge where we should invest in making the transition possible for all of us together. And like that was, I probably must have been really unclear, but that was my plea really to say, let's make this a common challenge and not to be divided over it.
Thank you. Two questions there, lady in the white and lady in the red.
Hi, Ulrike Lunacek, former Vice President of the European Parliament from Austria, now with the Austrian Institute of International Affairs. The one question I have to Mr. Freudenstein is, you said that a solution like fighting climate change and getting the economy carbon-free and getting jobs in that area is something you cannot imagine, for example, for Bulgaria. Now, I don't know Bulgaria that well. Maybe you know it. But I really wonder why you're saying that. Because we've seen in regions where I know from, like in my own country, where others, like especially with small businesses, but also with big industry, where, yes, there's a big chance in fighting climate change and making new jobs in that area. So connecting ecology and economy. And I don't see why this is not something that would also work in Bulgaria, other parts. So I really would like that from. And the other part, I think it was you, Kostas, who talked about the question that people don't see the European Union as us, but it's Brussels. That's my experience as well. And it's really one of the, for me, the main topic for the next 5 years. How do we get those citizens who don't vote for the extreme right, but the ones who are disappointed, who sort of feel and frustrated and they want more out of the EU. How is it possible to create this, that we all are Europeans and it's us? It's our governments, it's us, ourselves, and it's people we know, it's civil society there. How do we get that change done that it's us Europeans and not somebody far away in Brussels?
Thank you very much. I think the lady directly behind you also wanted to speak.
Thank you. Anu Bradford from Finland and the United States. I teach at Columbia Law School. So I have a question to Eva and then to Marta. So to Eva, what is the relative role of the lack of economic opportunities and then the desire to flee corrupted governments? And what is the relative role of the EU and the Bulgarian government to remove that disincentive for returning? And then Marta, you brought up one of my favorite topics, competition policy. And what I'm curious though is that whether you share my fear that there's a danger in how do we draw the line, that we do not move to a protectionist policy. And I'm also worried about two spillover effects. So we also have competition policy control at the national level. So if the EU moves to that kind of merger policy, what happens when French are reviewing then the acquisitions by German companies or French companies? And the other, that the EU has been tremendously successful in exporting its competition policy abroad. We have 120 countries with the competition policy around the world, and a great majority follow a European competition policy. So are you worried that we will also be exporting then this kind of potentially protectionist way of screening competition cases in the other countries that look to Europe?
Thank you very much. I think there was one more question over here. I think we've intimidated the men in the room with our female-dominated panel, but just to say you are allowed to speak as well if you're male. Nice to be able to say that for once. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Željko Jovanović from Open Society Foundations. So it seems to me that European voters also sent a message that is not recognized here, it's not recognized in the media, it's not recognized in the analysis that I've seen in the public sphere on this topic. And this is the message about representation of minorities. We have the analysis that shows that comparing to the 18 representatives of minorities in European Parliament, now we have 30. And we speak about the voters that voted for far right, and we see the swing in the case of Greece and Germany, but we don't speak a lot about the voters who were actually the targets of the far right. Minorities like Roma or Muslims and so on. So it seems to me that when minority representatives appeared in a higher number, some for the first time in the US midterm elections, that was in the news. But when minorities increasingly come now in European Parliament and, for example, in the Spanish elections that were also covered in the news, 4 members of the parliament in Spain now belong to Roma minority. This didn't come also in the news, and that is unprecedented result in European politics. So I wonder on both sides of the panel, what's your interpretation of this?
Thank you for that important question. I will take one more question from the lady back right there. Thank you very much. And then I'll turn it back to the floor. To the panel, sorry.
Thank you. I'm Christine Bosse. I'm chairing the Danish European Movement. I'm a non-executive professional, and I'm also a colleague of Eva's on the EMI board. I would like to hear especially the political comments on values. You sort of touched upon it slightly, but is there not, alongside with what has been shown now with the election, also a clear demand for the defense of Article 2, human rights, rule of law, all these issues, and how do you interpret exactly that, and how do you think is the right way to go around it? And then one final thing, is it correct for the national heads of state not to look clearly differently to the Spitzenkandidat process with the clear backing from the people in Europe in the just EP elections? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So a wide range of questions, and we're coming to the end of the time for this panel now. So I'm going to give all the speakers the challenge of trying to give us kind of 1 minute and 30 seconds on whichever issues you want to dig into, from national versus EU level responsibilities to values to minority representation, competition policy, connected economies, and how to bring the different parts of Europe together over climate change, and by that I mean politically as well as regionally. Eva, you start.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. Just need to find my notes. So on the question of Anno, if I heard correctly, I don't think we have a particular survey, but however, from the data that I've looked into and the different groups of people that I have talked, I think immigrating is based mainly on the reasons of looking for a better economic opportunity. And I think more and more young professionals go abroad, study, and this is official data, return. And there is still a percentage, colleagues of yours, actually the youngest Harvard professor is a Bulgarian economist of 33 years old. She is still unsure how to return even though she wants to, due to corruption issues and that big topic that we have to address in a much more robust way. Last year was the first year that more, and I don't want to turn this into a Bulgarian thing, actually it's perhaps the panel that I've attended, the first panel in 5 years that I talk so much about my country, which is great in a way, but I think it's a more wide, it should be a wider panel, even though you can see a similar pattern in other member states like Croatia, for example, Romania and others. And I think that that's the thing we have to address. Last year is the first year where more people have returned rather than immigrated. So the trend after more than 20 years has changed. And I would like to see this continuing. And we have to obviously work more to address that part. On values. The campaign, at least that I had to fight for, it was so difficult sometimes to talk about values. It would depend with which group of people you would talk. If you would be in a more urban area, if you're in a more rural area, citizens clearly feel certain things more close to them, as also the surveys show rightly, I think. And it's more and more about topics. And earlier when I spoke about the feeling of being European, I think it's also linked through about what we want to see in the next generation. There are plenty of European countries in school where the European Union is discussed in 1 or 2 pages in a history book. I would like to see more youngsters knowing about their European history in order for them to build that vision for Europe ahead of us. And perhaps because that's going to be my wrap-up last part, one point I didn't address is we desperately do need visionary European leaders. People that can take swift decisions, people that would not just blame Brussels, people that would not leave the council room without decisions, and people, I like to call them the digital leaders. They don't necessarily have to be able to code, but those people should understand the fast pace with which economy and society is moving. Those should be the people to try to reinforce Europe in the next couple of years. Because if today we have everything in our PAL, in our mobile phone, and we can easily do whatever we want with our family or professional life, that's not the case with governments and institutions. So a little bit more visionary leadership would help Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kostas, if I could ask you to be even more brief.
Yes, I'll try to be as quick as possible. Values. I think that one of the key values that we need to defend right now and fight for is a non-typical and non-traditional one. It has to do with civility and moderation and respect. Unfortunately, I think that's a common theme across Europe. Our political dialogue has become very toxic, has been poisoned. So it's up to us to actually fight against polarization and for a decency in public dialogue. I think that's a core element of democracy. And at least my experience is that there's also a thirst amongst our people to actually elevate ourselves. We may agree, we may disagree, but at least try and keep ourselves on a certain level. In terms of minorities, I think you're absolutely right. It's a very good point. I would love to see a survey about how different electoral systems have an impact on minority representation. I think that will teach us a lot about moving forward, and it will also reveal many things. One last point about Europe. You mentioned, and I think you were right, that many of us were too critical of Europe. I don't think that any of us really want to do that. It was just that Europe is a topic of discussion right now. But there is one thing that I think we can all agree with, whether we want to see Europe one way or the other. We want a Europe moving forward that assumes its responsibilities, that actually does not hide, does not find alibis about not doing things and not delivering. Let me give you an example. The past 2 or 3 months in Greece, going towards the election for the European Parliament, there was only one time really that there was debate or discussion about the big political families, and that was with EPP and Urban. The moment EPP's decision was actually a decision that was a subject of discussion. It was the only, unfortunately, real discussion we had about big political families in Greece 3 months going to the election. And I think that says a lot about how Europe can move forward.
Thank you very much, Franziska.
Yeah, you had raised a question about values, Article 2, and I think it feeds into many of the other points we had today, the question of people returning to their countries. Like we have the situation in Berlin, we're really happy about, for example, hosting now the Open Society Foundations, but, they leave Hungary for a reason, and so do many other young Hungarians who now do live in Berlin or Frankfurt, Munich, etc. And the same is true for Romanians, etc. So I think there's this linked, and we have to be frank about it, that it's part of the story if you talk about rule of law and emigration. And we are thinking, or what I've heard from the negotiations in the parliament, on substance, not on people, but that might be the part that gets through, is that they will ask for some independent monitoring of all EU member states in relation to Article 2. And I think that this would be a really big step in advance. And then linking it to the budget, and I hope it will be done in a smart way so that we don't just take the money away from the concerned country, but just take it away from the concerned government, so that, whatever, Orban is no longer responsible for dispensing the money, but an independent foundation, but the money stays with Hungary. So I hope that we will find smart ways of defining new mechanisms, and we cannot wait 5 more years, because for that you need qualified majority. Luckily you don't need unanimity, but qualified majority. And thanks to some Ibiza video, it might be easier at the moment to get there, but who knows where we will be in 5 years. So I think that this is, for example, one of the urgent issues that we have to address when it comes to the budget negotiations, because they are linked. And that will be in the next year. And also with that, when you said, the national level is responsible for the economic situation, yeah, partially, but you cannot deny that those who are within the euro, it's not just what they do nationally. And even for the other countries, we do depend, with that intertwined market, you cannot just say, whatever, it doesn't depend on what the other Europeans do. And I rather think that we have to increase the awareness that we are so interdependent, that we have to invest more together. And I think that is part of the next budget. I think it would be so great if we could make it the budget that addresses the challenge of economic and social transformation. If we make that the big budget that we can do together, that would be a real signal to our citizens that we are delivering. So I hope we will get there. I'm optimistic that the pressure in the street will not stop.
Sylvie, do you want to say something? Yes.
There's another panel, I think. Yeah? On the minorities, I agree with you. We have to do much better, but this is very much at the level of national countries, electoral systems, and so. But yes, there is a task to be taken on this. And just one thing, since I'm the only representative of the media here on Europe, we have to find. It's very difficult to find this balance between. Not being complacent, of course, and not be deluding ourselves on, a huge sigh of relief, and it's not as bad as we expected, so it's okay. We can keep muddling through, and criticizing Europe all the time and saying it's bad and we're failing and it's terrible. And this is, I must say, something that we do very well in the media, at least in France, and so. It's important for the psychology of the voters and of European citizens to try to find this balance.
Roland, is there a way for both Europe and national level governments to take credit for what goes well over the next period?
If they deliver. No, but I really have to come back to this climate change thing, because I'm afraid I'm going to make myself really unpopular with some people here, but I have to say this. Look, yes, it will be a polarizing issue in our societies, and that's not because a small minority denies climate change and the rest say that it is an issue. No, the question is how to deal with it. And there is not only one way to deal with climate change. And there's not only one way to match means and end. And yes, there is a political family in Europe, and that tends to be the Greens, Frau Lunacek, who have given at least rise to the suspicion that they seem to believe the truth. They seem to know the one true way how to tackle climate change. And we are going to have controversies about this, and we're going to solve this politically. Look, I'm old enough to remember how the Club of Rome predicted that we'd run out of fossil fuels in 2005? Yeah. About. I was a witness to predictions that the forests were dying from acid rain. This did not happen. And can we please make this a political debate where means matches the ends and where we have a democratic debate about the right way to tackle with a problem. And not consider like some part of society mentally retarded because they have a different concept.
So I think we're going to have a very lively debate over the coffee break. Marta, last minute to you.
No, only one word on that. I think that we are in front of a climate crisis, first. Second, I think that the solution must come from business and from technology, and this is entirely possible. It's already happening. If we go on measuring our distance from Paris, is not so important. The fact is that business is making a business of decarbonization. We have a reduction which is much more important in the US than elsewhere. So, I mean, this will happen, in my view. May I add one very small point? Competition policy is an example of the wage issues, this kind of divisive issues we will have in this Europe of the European Parliament, much more divided, the European Council much more fragmented, and still we need to find a new balance, in my view, between the consumer protection and the need for global competition. So competition policy is high on the agenda from my point of view. And my final remark on muddling through, Kostas, I don't think that we have the luxury of muddling through for the next 5 years because external pressures are too quick and are too strong. So in a way or another, Europe will go ahead. My real worry is that it will fragment inside. We will have groupings, variable geometries, etc., etc., etc. I'm a bit sad because Italy will be completely sidelined.
Thank you very much to all our panellists. I don't think we've come up with any quick solutions, but lots of food for thought and conversations that we can continue over the next couple of days. So it's now, if you want to grab a quick coffee and then come back for the panel on European sovereignty in a multipolar world.